It's good to be with you again today as we continue our discussion of mental health and faith, particularly in the context of this pandemic that we are dealing with right now. So in this presentation titled, Am I or Someone Dear to Me Depressed? We're going to actually talk about what is depression, what does the diagnosis of depression look like, and then we're going to kind of see if we might be struggling with depression or if somebody that we know might be struggling with depression. And I think what we'll find is that it's relatively easy to determine if somebody is struggling with that. And then we want to make sure that we move that person on to some mental health care provision so that they might be better. So let's just kind of jump right in. And what we when we define depression, I think, from a very clinical perspective, it just is a diagnosis, or a statement that really doesn't mean a lot to people, and that's one or more major depressive episodes. And most people don't understand what a depressive episode means. But from a more kind of general perspective, what we might say about depression is that it's a persistent depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure in daily activities that lasts for at least 2 weeks. So a persistent depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure in what you would consider normal pleasurable activities, and it lasts for at least 2 weeks. So there's an intensity to it, and there's also a chronicity to it. It has to appear over a long period of time. So it's not just a bad day where you're kind of down. As far as the prevalence goes, it's extremely prevalent. About 17% of the population struggles from depression. It's only second to anxiety disorders as one of the most common of mental health problems. And then we find that it's twice as common in women as it is in men. So women are particularly susceptible to depression. In fact, unfortunately, what we find is that women have more suicidal thoughts. They also tend to attempt suicide at a higher rate than men, whereas men, unfortunately, are more successful at suicide because they use more lethal means. And we're going to talk about suicide today as we go through and discuss depression. So let me describe for you and give you the criteria for a depressive episode. So how does a clinician look at depression, and how would we determine if somebody was depressed? Because we use that term very cheaply. We will say, oh, I'm depressed today just because I'm kind of sad. Sadness and depression are related, but different, very different things. So how does a clinician determine if somebody meets a criteria for clinical depression? It's all about a major depressive episode. You have to define that. So let me give you the actual kind of diagnostic definition and criteria for what that looks like. So this is how it's described. 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change in previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is either a depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure. So that's our first thing. We either have that persistent depressed mood or that loss of interest or pleasure. And then you have to have 4 more of these, okay? Decreased interest, significant weight change or a change in appetite, okay? Change in sleep, you either sleep too much or you sleep too little. Change in activity, you're either overly active and agitated or you barely move around at all. Fatigue or loss of energy, guilt or worthlessness, problems in concentration, and then suicidality. You have thoughts of death and dying or of harming yourself. So you have to have that depressed mood or loss of interest and pleasure, and then you have to have 4 of these other ones. So that's a pretty specific set of criteria. It's not just somebody being sad. So again, just having a depressed mood or a sad mood is not enough to be depressed. You have to see this change in functioning in the context of these other things that I've talked about. So recognize that. If you're looking at somebody, you're looking at yourself and you're trying to make that determination. Is it affecting your ability to function? And are you seeing several of these in your life right now? So one of the things that I find, particularly when I talk to pastors, is they have difficulty differentiating between, say, someone who is in a blue period or their mood is down, and somebody who's struggling with depression. Because there's certainly subclinical, what a clinician would say, subclinical aspects to depression. You can be sad, okay? And that's not depression. So what's the difference between, say, being blue and having depression? So let me just give you a little description of that. In a blue period, the feelings are characterized by an absence of normal intensity. Typical sensations are of being dulled or having the blahs. Lack of intensity is noticed, and intensity of life is missed. So you're just kind of down. You feel kind of, as I said, blah. You describe it in that way. The low mood does not last as long and is generally interrupted by brighter moments. or hours or even longer periods of time. So for instance, you might be kind of down, but your buddy calls you and says, hey, let's go see that new comedy movie, and you go and you really enjoy that. And hey, later you may get down again, but at least for that period of time, your spirits were up and you seemed kind of elevated in your mood. Or you went out to coffee with a friend and it made you feel better, and now you're down again. So there's an opportunity for moments of kind of pleasure or joy or brighter moments. The depressed feelings seem like time spent away from life at its best. You sense that you're off or not your usual self. So you see that this isn't how you normally are, and you want to get back to how you were in the past. So that's kind of how you describe a blue period. And I think we've all been through that. We all know what that's like. That's not depression. Let me describe depression for you. The feelings are extremely intense in terms of emotional pain, depths of despair, sense of hopelessness and helplessness, and damage to essential life energy. In severe cases, the intensity can turn into a deadening flatness and inability to feel anything other than mental pain. So it's a very different level of intensity than that blue period. In fact, you hear me using the term pain, and that's how people with depression describe it. Symptoms are long-lasting and are generally uninterrupted, persistent, and intractable. You don't have moments where you're back to a normal state of pleasure, a normal state of brightness. You're always down in the darkness. Depression becomes your way of life or life itself, your identity. You identify with your condition. You're depressed. It is not only how you feel, it is who you are. You don't think of yourself as, this is how I am right now, and I used to be a different way, and I want to get back to that. I'm just kind of out of sorts right now. You identify with that darkness, with that depression. That's what you are, and you can't even remember what it was like to not be that way, and you have no hope that you'll ever not be that way, the way that you are right now. So the intensity, the depth, the pain is significant, very different than what you see with someone who's in a blue period. So I think it's important that we, as believers and working with others and trying to minister to people, I think we need to be able to differentiate those from one. They both need some assistance. We can help people through them. But there's a real difference. We don't want to kind of minimize somebody's depression as if it's a blue period, and we don't want to kind of exaggerate someone's blue period as suggest that it might be depression. So what's going on with someone in their brain when they're dealing with depression? It's a neurochemical. You've heard the chemical imbalance term, which has kind of gotten a bad rap, but there's a neurochemical imbalance that's occurred. And it's really two neurochemicals that's going on. One is a serotonin, what we also call 5-HT, 5-hydroxytryptamine, and norepinephrine. Those two neurochemicals in your brain are out of sorts. And so what are those involved in, and what does that mixture cause us to feel like and sense? So serotonin is involved in our sleep, it's involved in our appetite, and it's also involved in our ability to control our impulses, to control our behavior. So under normal circumstances, it helps you sleep. It controls, you have appropriate appetite, and you can control your behavior. Norepinephrine is an excitatory neurotransmitter, whereas serotonin is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine is excitatory. It's involved in alertness, concentration, motivation. It rouses you to action. If I were to inject you with norepinephrine, which in Europe is referred to as noradrenaline, which is kind of a variant of adrenaline or epinephrine, you would become almost panic attack-ish. Your heart would race, you would be alert, you would be very active and moving. So it's an activating kind of neurotransmitter. And so those two are very important. They're certainly normal when they're balanced out, and that kind of helps us navigate. But what happens when they both are depressed? Levels are both low, and that's what we see in individuals who have depression. You find a depressed mood, as we've described. You have heightened anxiety, kind of an agitation, irritability, vague aches and pains in the body. If you've ever seen that commercial that says depression hurts, it's an advertisement for a medication. People with depression do complain of greater aches and pains because an alteration in these neurochemicals causes them to be more sensitive to pain. There's a lot of irritability, and there's some alterations in cognitive function. The person is so focused on thoughts of worthlessness and hopelessness and being devalued that it really inhibits their ability to concentrate and to think and to learn. So when these two neurotransmitters are out of whack, It completely alters both your moods and your cognitive functioning. In fact, we've talked about depression so far. You could have a depressed mood, or you could have a loss of interest or pleasure in normally pleasurable activities or events. And really what we find is that when it's more of an epinephrine or norepinephrine driven depression, you have the lack of interest. When it's more of a serotonin driven depression, you have more of the depressed mood. But in all depression, it's a lowered level of these two neurotransmitters that really causes the changes in mood. And so what's ultimately, when we talk about treatment, we're going to have to somehow bring those neurochemicals back into balance so that the individual can move beyond this depressive state. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, that sounds great. I recognize now that you've got this very specific criteria and all this. It's not a subjective decision that's made. But how would I tell if my neighbor, my wife, my son, myself were depressed? How would I know if I needed to go on to a mental health care provider? So I'm going to give you 9 questions from a device that's called the Patient Health Questionnaire, the PHQ-9. I'm going to give you 9 questions and tell you how they're scored. And I'm going to make these PowerPoints available so you'll be able to get this. You don't have to try to write this down now. But these 9 questions will help you determine whether a person meets a clinical level of depression and needs to be able to move on to a mental health care provider. So you'll see that they pretty much mimic the criteria that we've been talking about. So the first question is this. You want to ask the person, how often have you been bothered by the following over the past 2 weeks? How often have you been bothered by the following over the past 2 weeks? And they're going to answer each question in this way. They're going to say, not at all. That's a score of 0. Several days. That's a score of 1. More than half the days. That's a score of 2. And nearly every day is a score of 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3 for each item. And so the first item is little interest or pleasure in doing things. So how often have you been bothered by the following over the last 2 weeks? Little interest or pleasure in doing things. And they might say several days, okay? Number 2, feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. Again, over the last 2 weeks. Is it not at all, several days, more than half the days, nearly every day? Trouble falling or staying asleep, or sleeping too much. Feeling tired or having little energy. Poor appetite or overeating. Feeling bad about yourself or that you are a failure or have let yourself or your family down. Trouble concentrating on things such as reading the newspaper or watching television. Moving or speaking so slowly that other people could have noticed, or so fidgety or restless that you've been moving a lot more than usual. And thoughts that you could be thoughts that you would be better off dead, or thoughts of hurting yourself in some way. So there's your suicidality. So those 9 items scored 0, 1, 2, 3 over the last 2 weeks. If an individual scores less than 4, a 4 or less on those 9 items, then they have minimal depressive issues and they don't need to be concerned. If an individual scores higher than a 4, then they likely meet criteria for depression at that period of time. And it really would be advisable for them to seek out some professional mental health care. If you don't know where to go, a great place to start would be with your primary care physician. But 4 or less, minimal depressive symptoms. Greater than 4, likelihood of major depressive disorder. So again, I will make these available. And you'll have all of that there and you'll have that. So again, it's not like you need to just put that in front of somebody and say, hey, would you fill this out? I think you're depressed. You can ask them those questions in the context of a conversation and get a sense. Maybe even you can score it in your head as they tell you how they felt over those 2 weeks. So let's talk about suicidality a little bit, because that last question is pretty disturbing. What if somebody tells you that they have been thinking about harming themselves, or they have been having a lot of thoughts of death or dying, or you hear them talking a lot about death and dying, saying it's better off that I just didn't exist, it'd be better if I never was born, my family would be better off if I was gone. You hear those types of things from them and you become concerned. What do you need to do if you're concerned that an individual may be having suicidal thoughts? Well, you have to engage them. I mean, this is a life or death kind of situation, and you have to engage them. So you need to ask really kind of 3 questions. Number 1, you have to be very overt, and you need to ask them, are you having suicidal thoughts? Are you thinking about hurting yourself or killing yourself? We'll put the myth aside. There's this idea out there that if you ask somebody about suicide, that you're putting the idea in their head and it makes it more likely that they might harm themselves. The data shows just the opposite. If you have a conversation with somebody about their suicidal thoughts, or if they're having suicidal thoughts, it becomes much less likely that they're going to harm themselves. So you have to ask them. It's a difficult question to ask somebody, but you have to ask them and engage them in that conversation. Are they thinking about harming themselves? If they say that they are, or you are still concerned after they answer that question that they are, you need to find out if they have a plan to do that. And so you have to ask a very difficult question to follow up, and that is, well, if you did harm yourself, how would you do it? I often give the example of a client that I had who I believed was having suicidal thoughts. I asked him if he was having those. He said he was. I asked him if he had a plan, and he said, absolutely, I have a plan. A couple of weeks ago, I went and bought a rope at Walmart. I even tied a noose in it, and I checked it in my garage to make sure that it would hold me where I was going to hang it, and it's sitting on the shelf out of my garage right now. That's a very bad sign. I mean, he has a plan and the means to carry out that plan. That's the third question. Do they have the means to carry out their plan? So for instance, someone who tells you, well, I would probably just shoot myself, but you know that they don't own a gun and they would have to go buy a gun, is certainly not at as much risk as somebody who says, I would shoot myself, and you know that they have loaded weapons at their home. And so you have to ask those three questions. Are you thinking about harming yourself? How would you do it since you are thinking about that? And do you have the means to carry that out? That will give you enough information on whether you need to move forward. If a person's having active suicidal thoughts, you need to act. You need to call 911. You need to take them to a hospital emergency room. You need to get them in front of an emergency personnel so that a decision can be made on whether they need to be hospitalized or there needs to be some treatment done immediately to save their life. This is a life or death situation. Another myth that I want to dismiss here is this idea that, well, what if I'm wrong? What if they get mad at me? Don't worry about that. I would rather that you err on the side of caution here, because this is life and death issue. So I've been doing this for a long, long time, and I can tell you right now, I've never seen a situation in which somebody acted on what they perceived to be someone's suicidality, and that person got mad at them and disconnected that relationship and hated them for the rest of their lives. I've just simply never seen that. The other thing is, you don't need to make a determination on whether they really are actively suicidal or not. You need to let the emergency personnel do that. You're simply concerned to the point that you need to bring emergency personnel in. They'll make a decision. You might take them to the ER, and the ER doctor might tell you, well, I don't think he's actively suicidal, so we're going to go ahead and let him go home. You let them make that decision. They've been trained to do that. So again, you have to act. This isn't an issue of whether you should act or maybe I should act or can I act. You have to act. You have to do something in that situation. And people that are depressed, they have a 20 times higher suicide rate than the general population. So just understand that if a person is struggling with depression, they're much more likely to have these types of suicidal thoughts, and they're much more likely to act out on those. So that's just another kind of contributing factor in this entire thing. So what are the treatments for depression? Well, number one, kind of the first line of treatment tends to be medication, some type of antidepressant. And as we discussed before, we have an imbalance in serotonin and norepinephrine. And so really kind of our primary types of medication that are used today are what are called SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They increase the level of serotonin in the brain, or selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. They increase the level of norepinephrine in the brain. And so both of those medications can be used to change the chemical balance that you see. There are other antidepressants that can be used, but those are your more common ones. There's also psychotherapy, which is a talking therapy, where you sit down with a therapist or a psychologist, and they kind of give you tools and skills to allow you to deal with your negative thinking and the feelings that you're having. Cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the most effective, which is called CBT a lot of times. Most effective for depression, and it's highly effective. A person can be treated fully with just talking therapy and doesn't necessarily have to take medication depending on the severity of their depression, but usually medication and talking therapy together are the most effective approach. Now, for perhaps more extreme examples where a person maybe doesn't respond to medication, there might be electroconvulsive therapy, which is where an individual is caused to have a little bit of a seizure from an electrical shock. And that's been found to help for people that don't respond to medication, but that's often used more in severe cases. And a newer technique, transcranial magnetic stimulation, has been FDA approved, where a magnet is placed near the outside of the head, and then a magnetic current is used to stimulate the cortex. It's non-invasive. The person sits there. You can have a conversation while it's occurring. You can drive yourself home. It's not a very invasive technique, but it has been shown to alleviate depressive symptoms in many individuals. And so that's becoming very popular as well. And so, depression is very common. Like I said, 17% of the population. So we really need to be aware of that commonality that's occurring out there. We also have to be aware that in a situation like we're in now with a pandemic, we're going to see heightened rates of depression. People that were depressed in the past are more likely to be depressed again. People who have never shown depression now are more likely to have a depressed mood. That may just be the blues, but now you have the tools, I think, to be able to go and differentiate that. And we also need to be very aware of suicidality, of people talking about harming themselves or being gone or disappearing, particularly children that might talk about that. Because we need to be very aware, because we are seeing an increase in suicidality as a result of the issues around the pandemic. So let's talk about depression a little bit from a spiritual issue, because a lot of times, I've run into individuals, pastors or different believers, that really feel depression is a sin, or that individuals that are Christians, believers, really should never be depressed because we have the joy of the Lord, we have Christ in us, we should not be depressed. Well, the reality is, as I've just described, depression is a neurochemical kind of factor, and it's not something that we really have full control over. So you can't just think your way out of it. There are people that are born with certain vulnerabilities that make them more prone to depression. There are people put into situations where they don't have the coping skills to deal with the situation, making them more likely to be depressed. So this isn't something that you can just say, well, I'm just not going to be depressed, or now that I'm a Christian, I just refuse to allow myself to be sad. The reality is that sadness occurs throughout the Bible. In fact, depression occurs in the Bible. And I'd like to give you just really one example so that you have a sense that, indeed, this is something that believers and non-believers alike struggle with. So this is Psalm 38, 6-10. This is King David. And just listen to the depression that this man is struggling with. I'm bowed down and brought very low. All day long I go about mourning. My back is filled with searing pain. There is no health in my body. I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of heart. All my longing lies open before you, Lord. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart pounds. My strength fails me. Even the light has gone from my eyes. Many of David's Psalms are like that. I mean, that is, in a sense, that's a modern day description of depression. He describes most of the symptoms of depression just in that psalm right there. But if we go through and we look at David's Psalms and we look at David's life, David is experiencing through really certainly the latter half of his life, he's experiencing all of the symptoms of depression that I've talked about. So let me just give you an idea of some of the things that he talks about in his Psalms. And David's just a wonderful character because we have not only historical narrative description of his life in several books of the Bible, we have his actual writings in the Psalms where we get a sense of how he's thinking and feeling. So David describes in several of the Psalms mourning and sorrow, weeping all day. He also talks about significant weight loss and a decrease in appetite. He says that he forgets to eat, that his bones cling to his flesh, that he's weak from fasting. He talks about insomnia, crying all night, no rest at night. I couldn't sleep. He talks about what we would refer to in clinical terms as psychomotor retardation, which means that he kind of has a lack of activity. Like a deaf and dumb man, I fear and I tremble, and he kind of lies around. Fatigue or loss of energy. Strength is dried up. It fails me. Vitality is drained away. My heart has withered within me. Feelings of worthlessness. I am a worm, not a man. A reproach to others. No one cares for my soul. I am in the song of the drunkards. A diminished ability to think or concentrate. It says he did not go to war when kings normally go to war. And we found that he was unable to discipline his rebellious sons when they obviously were rebelling. He was unable to perform these tasks, and in some sense it seems because he was kind of depressed or down. And he has recurrent thoughts of death. I am the dust of death. the terrors of death are upon me. I mean, he talks about that constantly. In fact, the majority of the Psalms that David wrote are Psalms of lament. We like to think about David really in one of two ways typically. We think about him killing Goliath as a young boy in this great heroic act, and we think about him dancing before the ark in his underwear, in a sense, happy and joyful. But the reality is that most of David's life, he's very, very down. And most of his life, he describes a very depressed state of being. But let's also remember who David is. David is the chosen one of God. He is anointed to be king. He is a man that God describes as a man after his own heart. If a man after God's own heart can struggle desperately with depression, how could depression then be looked at as a lack of spiritual faith or a lack of spiritual connectiveness to God? He desperately is seeking God. In fact, I oftentimes will describe David in this way: in a time long before depression was understood, in a time long before there was a treatment for depression, David found relief in music, in worship, and in prayer and seeking out for God. In fact, many of David's Psalms are him describing his depression, his sadness, his isolation, his separation from God, and yet somewhere in the middle of the psalm he'll say, "But yet this I bring to mind, that you have promised me this, or you are faithful in this, or that I know this of you." The character of God, the works of God, the power and the sovereignty of God brings relief to David as he kind of laments about his own suffering. So I do believe that faith is a tremendous asset to an individual who's struggling with depression. I think it's a wonderful foundation for recovery. But let's be very careful when we're working with our friends and family, or even thinking about our own struggles with depression, to not put it into a spiritual context in the sense that, well, I'm just a bad Christian, or if I just got my life more together with Jesus, I wouldn't be depressed. Because the reality is, and we can see it in David's own life, even an individual who is the man after God's own heart, God's anointed, chosen king of his people, can struggle with depressions. Because again, we live in a fallen world. We have fallen body, our fallen flesh that's broken. We can have these neurochemical imbalances. We are exposed to events that are overwhelming to us, like this pandemic. And we need to understand that we're going to struggle with these types of things. But God is faithful, and he is with us in these situations. And we do need to look to him first. But he has provided for us, through his graceful providence, opportunities for therapists and physicians to provide us medication, and friends and family that can walk along with us as we're down. And so, God is providing, he's sustaining, and he's healing us as we move through these difficult situations. So once again, do be aware of your own mood states. Do be aware of those around you. Look for a decrease in their ability to function. Look for those symptoms that I have described. And if you see somebody that's struggling with those, refer them to a mental health care provider. Go with them to a mental health care provider. Tell them that you want them to be able to enjoy life and enjoy that relationship with you that they had in the past, and that you're concerned about how their mood is right now. It's not their fault, but there is an opportunity for them to move beyond it. So thanks again.